What's going on, you guys? So today I figured I'd pick up the camera and go over a couple things that you run into when building vehicles. And it doesn't involve this car. So I'm going to go outside and show you the car that I've actually been working on. So this is the vehicle that I've been working on lately. It's a 2005 Pontiac GTO. This is actually my old GTO, my old daily driver that I used to have. The guy Derek that I sold it to ended up hitting me up. He wanted some work done to it, cam install and some trans work, some bushings, side adjusters for the diff, basically just like a bunch of little things. But we've been running into a lot of issues with building this car, and that's what I wanted to cover with you guys, is kind of show you the in-depth of what you can run into when you buy used parts or you send something out to get rebuilt by somebody and they don't know what they're working with and do it incorrectly. So I'm going to go over and cover some of the issues that we ran into with this car. So for starters, on the cam install. Now originally on an LS engine, I would do the cam with the motor in the car. The motor is back in because the motor is done. So we did cam, valve springs. I did end up pulling the motor out though, because as you can see down there, we ended up putting a Canton Racing oil pan on it. So with all the stuff we were doing, it was just easier to pull the whole engine, trans, all that out of the car to do it all. So we ended up pulling the motor and trans out. And cam install went fine. Valve spring install went fine. And then one thing that I always do whenever I'm installing any aftermarket camshaft is I always measure pushrod length. Now, there are many recommendations out there for measuring pushrod length. It's always a good idea to get a pushrod length checker and just double check your lengths on everything. And that looks like this. So this is an adjustable pushrod that you basically set in there and check what length your pushrod needs to be. There's plenty of videos and write-ups on how to do it, and if I try explaining it, it'll probably confuse you. While I was checking the pushrod length, something just felt off with the lifters, because they are hydraulic lifters. So there's like 125 thousandths range that you want to be in with the lifter length. Usually it's like a 7.400 is like a standard aftermarket cam pushrod. But when I measured them out, it was measuring at like a 7.360, which seemed way too small. And I could get almost no compression off the lifters. So usually you'll be able to push the lifters down with a push rod by hand. You can they're kind of tight, but you can usually push them down in there. And these ones just didn't want to move. Actually, when I put the 7400s in there and tighten the rockers down, it would open the valves even when they were on center. So you put it in there and intake, exhaust are both opened up, and that's not good. They weren't floating back up. Usually if you have a lifter that's a little tight, it'll compress it and then it'll slowly rise back up. They weren't rising back up. So that's usually a sign your lifters are starting to go. Now, the car ran before, and I'm guessing the reason it was running is because it had so much inertia in it that it was actually able to break them free, and the lifters were kind of operating. But anyways, I digress. So called Derek and said, hey, we have the motor out of the car. Let's just change the lifters. It's going to be another $300 in parts if we want to do ARP bolts, which I always recommend. So he said, go for it. We threw new lifters in it, measured it out. They measured out absolutely perfectly with a 7400. And, after that, good to go. That was the first issue we ran into. And it was the smallest of issues we were going to run into. Now, the next issue was on the T56 Magnum that we were putting in it. He bought all these parts used off of somebody who, I think there was a failure in the transmission or something like that. So the previous owner sent the trans out to a trans shop to get rebuilt. So they went through the entire thing. The tail shaft housing on the transmission got wiped out, so they replaced the tail shaft housing. Now, when they brought it back, I couldn't get the slip yoke to fit in it because of the seal that was on it. So originally I was like, okay, cool. They just put the wrong seal in. We got to change the seal out. So I called some auto parts stores, order up a seal, and then before I go out there, I'm like, you know what? Let's just pop that seal out of there real quick and just make sure that the yoke fits into this tail shaft housing. Well, there's the tail shaft housing that was on the T56 Magnum. And here is a T56 Magnum 31 spline yoke. That's a big problem. So my first thought is, okay, they put a stock T56 tail shaft housing on it, which is exactly what that is. Trans shop probably thought it was just a standard T56. When they put it back together, they put the wrong housing on it. No big deal. They're easy to change. You can get them from Tick Performance for like 250 bucks with a shifter. So he ordered a new tail shaft housing. I pull that one off, and when I pull that off, guess what I find sitting in the housing? A synchro detent sitting right in the bottom of the housing. And synchro detents are pretty important, so that meant I had to take the transmission apart. So that's what I did. Tore the transmission down, put the synchro detent back in there, reassembled everything, inspected everything first. Everything looked good. We got the new tail shaft housing, put it on. Okay, problem solved. Or so I thought. Here is the standard T56. On a T56 Magnum, it uses a 6-bolt shifter. And the shifter sits about there on the T56 Magnum. Now on the T56 for the GTO, shifter goes here, so this actually goes on the shifter rail. Shifter goes in there, and then it has an extension that puts the shifter about right here behind the transmission. So that's a pretty big difference in offset. Issue: this on the Magnum housing will not clear the trans tunnel. Now, the guy he bought it off had the transmission in a GTO before. So now I'm running around trying to chase another issue, is how does this fit? Like, how does this work? You know, I already have the transmission in the car at this point with the shifter off, and I'm trying to figure out how the hell somebody had a shifter in this. So I said, screw it, you know what? Before I even push this off the hoist right now, I'm gonna make sure the drive shaft that he bought fits. And then we ran into another problem. So let's go back out to the GTO right now, and I'll show you the problem that we ran into with that. So for starters, you can see how much further the shifter sits forward on the Magnum. Now this little notch right here is where the shifter rail comes out to. So on the standard T56, your shifter rail ends about right here and puts your handle right here. Now, imagine your handles being right here at the end of this. This is way longer extended than the standard T56 housing, which means the drive shaft that is made for the GTO T56 Magnum setup will not fit with that extension housing. So that extension housing is also wrong. After more digging, I found out the extension housing that is used on GTO specific T56 Magnum transmissions is a stock T56 extension housing bored out to fit a 31 spline yoke on, because obviously you're not fitting it out of there. And you can see from where the shifter is compared to the other one how much shorter this is. So that means the drive shaft won't fit. Our original solution was going to be, let's pop the yokes off and just get a drive shaft made and figure something out for the shifter, but that's really not the right way to do it. So I found the correct bearing for the correct bushing that goes in here for a T56 Magnum, and the correct seal for a T56 Magnum. So we're going to machine this all out, put the proper bearing and the proper seal on it, and that should be good. Now you're thinking, okay, cool, it'll all go back together just fine. Well, then I start inspecting the drive shaft. So I start inspecting the drive shaft on this and taking the yokes off and all that, because it really sucks. I feel bad for Derek. He sent this out and had somebody rebuild this with new U-joints and rebalanced it, even though they welded a steel washer to an aluminum drive shaft, which is not the correct way to do that. The riveting process is way more correct. But as I'm looking at this, see if I can get this on the camera, there is a hairline fracture all the way across this weld. Now my guess is that fracture happened during the welding process, probably created a small fissure inside the weld, and as it was used, it cracked. So, I mean, this drive shaft is pretty much useless at this point. I wouldn't ship a customer's car with a drive shaft like that on there, because, I mean, also, that's at the transmission yoke side, which is right next to you in the passenger compartment. So if you don't have a loop on that thing, and that thing snaps because of a shit weld, you could lose your fucking legs, you know? So, basically, we got to get a new drive shaft made for it regardless anyways now. So anyways, even with all of the little issues that we're kind of running into and all the problems, you know, you just got to go out of your way, find a solution to make things work. Figure out where things are wrong, do some research, and get the job done, you know? I'm not just going to sit here after he spent all this money on parts and dropped his car off, even though, you know, realistically, none of these issues were his fault. None of them were my fault. You know, if anybody, it's the trans shop's fault for putting the wrong housing on and, you know, leaving that detent out. But, you know, we just got to figure out where the problems are, figure out how to make it work, get the job done. That's the most important thing. You always run into issues like this when building a car, whether it be a street car build, a race car build. You're going to run into issues. Just don't give up, push forward, figure out where you need to make changes, figure out what you need to do to get a solution to the problem, and get the job done. Just thought I'd bring you guys into a little bit of the life of what it's like to do stuff like that and kind of the problems you run into along the way sometimes. So that's going to be it for this one. So like the video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Follow the builds along. Leave a question, comment down below, and I'll get back to it. And until the next one, I'll catch you guys later.